The bustling streets of the city were alive with the usual commotion, a symphony of honking horns, distant sirens, and the chatter of pedestrians weaving through their routines. Among them was Tasha, a bright-eyed black teenager with a heart full of dreams, and the confidence of someone who had learned early on to wear her identity with pride. Her long textured hair, often admired for its beauty, was not just a part of her. It was a symbol of her heritage, a testament to her self-expression and resilience. It was a warm afternoon when Tasha decided to take a shortcut through a quiet alley after finishing her shift at a local coffee shop. She had no idea her life was about to change in a way she could never have imagined. As she stepped out of the alley onto the main street, she was startled by the sharp sound of a car door slamming behind her. "Excuse me, miss," barked a voice. She turned to see a police officer striding toward her, his face set in a stern expression. His name tag read Officer Daniels, and there was something unsettling about the way his eyes scanned her, like she was already guilty of something she hadn't done. Tasha hesitated, clutching her backpack tightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," he said curtly, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Without further explanation, he gestured for her to follow him to his patrol car. Confused and increasingly anxious, Tasha tried to explain that she had just left work and had done nothing wrong. But Daniels wasn't listening. He was the kind of cop who thrived on authority, and he had decided that Tasha was his target. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Tasha barely had time to process it. Daniels forced her into the back of the patrol car and drove her to the station, ignoring her protests. Inside the cold, sterile walls of the precinct, he treated her not like a citizen deserving of respect, but as an object of ridicule. His words were sharp, his demeanor dehumanizing. And then the unimaginable happened. Daniels ordered Tasha to sit down in a chair, his hand gripping a pair of electric clippers. "This'll teach you a lesson," he sneered. Tasha froze, her heart pounding in disbelief. He was going to shave her hair. Her hair, a source of her pride and identity, was about to be stripped away in an act of pure humiliation. She tried to resist, but Daniels was relentless. He called it protocol, though everyone in the room knew there was no justification for what he was doing. The sound of the clippers rolled in her ears, and tears streamed down her face as strands of her hair fell to the floor. When it was over, Tasha felt numb. She stared at her reflection in the smudged window, barely recognizing the girl who looked back at her. She wasn't just angry, she was devastated. But even in that moment of despair, a fire ignited within her, a determination to make sure this abuse of power didn't go unanswered. Little did Daniels know the wheels of justice were already turning. Unbeknownst to him, a fellow officer in the station had secretly recorded the entire ordeal. The officer, a rookie who had grown disillusioned with the corruption he'd seen within the force, knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He uploaded the footage anonymously, and within minutes, it began spreading like wildfire across social media. Tasha's story quickly captured the attention of millions. People from all walks of life were outraged, their voices rising in unison to demand accountability. Protests erupted outside the precinct, and hashtags like #JusticeForTasha and #EndPoliceAbuse began trending worldwide. The pressure was mounting, and Daniels was about to face consequences he never saw coming. But just as the tide seemed to turn in Tasha's favor, an unexpected twist threatened to complicate her fight for justice. A knock at her door late that night brought news she couldn't have anticipated, news that would test her resolve and force her to confront a system designed to protect people like Daniels. Tasha sat in her small apartment, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the news on her phone. The images of herself in the police station, her face streaked with tears, were everywhere. She couldn't escape the sight of her own humiliation replayed over and over. The video, though painful to watch, had become a rallying cry for justice. People she had never met were speaking her name, demanding accountability for what had been done to her. But as empowering as it was to see the world on her side, it also terrified her. A sharp knock at her door jolted her from her thoughts. It was almost midnight, and the knock wasn't the kind you'd expect from a friend or neighbor. It was loud, deliberate, and insistent. Tasha hesitated, her heart racing. She tiptoed to the peephole and peered out. Two figures stood on the other side, their faces partially obscured by the dim hallway light. "Tasha Carter." One of them called out, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk to you." Her pulse quickened. "Who is it?" she asked cautiously, her voice barely audible. "We're with the Civil Rights Advocacy Group," the man replied. "We're here to help." Tasha's grip on the doorknob tightened. She had heard about organizations like this, but how could she be sure they were who they claimed to be? After everything that had happened, trust didn't come easily. "We're here because of the video," the man continued, as if sensing her hesitation. "We know what happened to you, and we believe your story can lead to real change. But we need your permission to move forward." Tasha slowly unlocked the door, cracking it open just enough to see them clearly. The man was in his early 40s, dressed in a crisp suit, his expression earnest. Beside him stood a woman with a notepad and a determined look in her eyes. Something about them felt genuine, and after a moment's pause, she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside. They entered, their presence filling the small space. The woman introduced herself as Maria, a legal advocate specializing in cases involving police misconduct. The man, James, was a community organizer who had spent years fighting for justice in cases like hers. They spoke with a calm urgency, explaining that the video had sparked not only public outrage, but also legal interest. "Tasha, the footage is powerful," Maria said, her voice steady but kind. "But we need more than public anger to hold Officer Daniels accountable. We need your voice." Tasha nodded slowly, her mind racing. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been mistreated like this. But the thought of stepping into the spotlight, of sharing her pain with the world, was overwhelming. "What happens if I don't?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "If you don't, there's a chance this story fades away. Daniels might get a slap on the wrist, and then he'll go back to work, free to do this to someone else. But if you speak up, Tasha, you could be the reason he's held accountable. You could help change the system that allowed this to happen." Tasha looked down at her hands, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She thought about the video, the protests, the countless strangers who had rallied behind her without even knowing her name. She thought about her hair now gone, and the way Daniels had laughed as he stripped her of something so personal. She thought about her family, her friends, and the young girls who might look up to her one day. Finally, she looked up, her voice steady. "What do I need to do?" Maria smiled, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "We'll guide you through it," she said. "But first, we need to gather more details about what happened that day. Every detail matters, Tasha. Even the smallest thing could make a difference." Tasha spent the next hour recounting the events leading up to her arrest. She talked about her shift at the coffee shop, the alley, and the moment Daniels approached her. She described his tone, his words, and the way he dismissed her attempts to explain herself. She spoke about the humiliation of being dragged into the station, the coldness of the officers who looked on and said nothing, and the utter helplessness she felt as her hair was shaved off. Maria took meticulous notes, her pen moving swiftly across the page. James listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. By the time Tasha finished, the weight of reliving the experience was etched across her face. "You were incredibly brave to share that with us," Maria said, her voice filled with empathy. "We're going to make sure your story is heard." As they prepared to leave, Maria handed Tasha a card. "Call us anytime," she said. "And remember, you're not alone in this." Tasha closed the door behind them, leaning against it as she exhaled deeply. She felt a strange mix of relief and fear. For the first time since that awful day, she felt like she wasn't entirely powerless, but she also knew the fight ahead would be anything but easy. The following morning, Tasha woke to find her story dominating the headlines. News anchors debated the implications of the video, while social media was flooded with messages of support and, inevitably, backlash. Some people questioned the authenticity of the footage, while others tried to dig into her past, searching for anything that could discredit her. It was overwhelming, but Tasha refused to let it break her. Then came another knock at her door. This time, it was a pair of detectives from Internal Affairs. They claimed to be investigating Daniels, but their questions felt more accusatory than supportive. They pressed her about her behavior during the incident, subtly implying that she might have provoked him. "Why didn't you comply immediately?" one of them asked, his tone sharp. Tasha stared at him, her frustration boiling over. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said firmly. "Why is that so hard for you to believe?" The detectives exchanged a glance but didn't respond. They left shortly after, their visit leaving Tasha more determined than ever to see this through. As the days passed, the pressure on the police department grew. Protesters gathered outside the station, their chants echoing through the streets. News outlets dug into Daniels' history, uncovering a troubling pattern of complaints that had been quietly swept under the rug. The community was demanding answers, and for the first time, it seemed like the system might actually be forced to respond. But just as things seemed to be shifting in her favor, Tasha received a chilling phone call late one night. Tasha, the voice on the other end, said, low and menacing, "You don't know who you're messing with. Drop this or you'll regret it." Her blood ran cold as the line went dead. She sat there in the dark, her mind racing. The fight for justice had just become more dangerous, and Tasha knew she had to decide how far she was willing to go to stand up for what was right. Tasha sat frozen on her couch, the weight of the threatening phone call settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Her hands trembled as she stared at her phone, the caller's voice replaying in her mind. She knew she had touched a nerve, that her fight for justice had made her a target. But fear wasn't the only emotion coursing through her. It was accompanied by anger. Whoever had made that call wanted to scare her into silence, but Tasha wasn't about to back down. Not now. The next morning she called Maria and James, her voice shaking as she recounted the events of the night before. They listened carefully, their concern evident. Maria immediately suggested notifying the authorities, but Tasha hesitated. "What's the point?" she said bitterly. "The same system that let Daniels get away with this is the one I'm supposed to trust. What if it's someone from the department trying to intimidate me?" Maria sighed, understanding Tasha's frustration. "You're right to be cautious, but you don't have to face this alone. We can provide security, and we'll make sure this is documented. Threats like this are serious, Tasha. It's proof you're making an impact." James chimed in, his tone resolute. "This is bigger than Daniels now. They're trying to protect something, a system, a culture. That's what you're up against. But remember, the louder your voice gets, the harder it'll be for them to silence you." Tasha nodded, their words giving her a renewed sense of determination. She agreed to let them document the threat and take precautions, though she couldn't shake the unease that followed her throughout the day. She jumped at every unexpected sound, her gaze constantly darting to her window or door. The fight was getting harder, and the stakes were climbing higher. Meanwhile, the video's impact continued to ripple outward. News outlets began digging deeper into Officer Daniels' past, uncovering a series of complaints that painted a damning picture. There were allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal abuse, all of which had been quietly dismissed or buried by the department. It became clear that Daniels wasn't just a bad apple, he was a symptom of a larger problem. At the same time, Tasha's story resonated with others who had experienced similar abuses. People began coming forward, sharing their own encounters with officers like Daniels. Each story added fuel to the growing movement, and Tasha's name became a symbol of resistance and hope. But with that visibility came new challenges. Social media, once a source of support, became a battleground. While countless users rallied behind Tasha, others hurled insults and accusations, trying to discredit her. She must have done something to deserve it. Some comments read, "Why didn't she just comply?" Others accused her of seeking attention or fabricating the story altogether. Tasha tried to ignore them, but the words cut deep. One night, as she scrolled through the comments, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, her stomach knotting. It was a single photo, her apartment building, taken from the street. The message that followed was chilling. "We're watching." Panic surged through her, and she immediately called Maria, her voice trembling. "They know where I live," she whispered. What if they come after me?" "We'll get you out of there," Maria said firmly. "Pack a bag. I'll arrange for a safe place." Within hours, Tasha was relocated to a secure location, her address known only to a trusted few. The fear lingered, but so did her resolve. If they were going to these lengths to silence her, it meant they were afraid of what she represented, and that thought gave her strength. As the days turned into weeks, the fight continued to escalate. The protests outside the precinct grew larger, with people demanding not only justice for Tasha but systemic change. Activists called for Daniels' termination and criminal charges, as well as an independent investigation into the department's handling of misconduct. The pressure was unrelenting, and it was starting to show. Inside the precinct, tensions ran high. Officers whispered about the video and the growing backlash, their loyalty to Daniels beginning to waver. Some openly questioned why he had been allowed to act unchecked for so long, while others clung to the thin blue line, insisting that Daniels had only been doing his job. The division within the department mirrored the larger conflict playing out in the streets and online. Among those caught in the middle was Officer Ramirez, a young recruit who had been on duty the day Daniels shaved Tasha's hair. He had stood silently in the corner, too afraid to intervene. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and as the protests grew louder, so did his conscience. One night, unable to sleep, he pulled out his phone and began drafting an anonymous letter. In it, he detailed what he had witnessed, confirming that Daniels' actions were not only unauthorized but fueled by a personal vendetta. He described how Daniels had bragged about putting people like her in their place, and how the other officers had either laughed along or looked the other way. Ramirez's letter ended with a plea for change, not just for Tasha, but for everyone who had suffered under the system's failure. The letter, shared anonymously with the press, caused an immediate stir. It added credibility to Tasha's claims and further exposed the toxic culture within the department. Daniels, once confident in his ability to escape accountability, found himself increasingly isolated. His superiors, desperate to contain the fallout, placed him on administrative leave, but it was clear that wasn't enough to quell the outrage. Despite these developments, Tasha's battle was far from over. Maria warned her that the legal process would be slow and arduous, with no guarantees of justice. The department's lawyers were already working to discredit her, questioning her character and motives. They argued that Daniels had acted within his rights, twisting the narrative to paint Tasha as uncooperative and combative. But Tasha wasn't alone. With Maria, James, and a growing network of supporters by her side, she prepared to face the challenges ahead. Her story had become a catalyst for change, a mirror reflecting the deeply ingrained issues that so many had tried to ignore. And while the path forward was uncertain, one thing was clear: Tasha wasn't giving up. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension as the trial against Officer Daniels began. Tasha sat at the plaintiff's table, her heart pounding as she looked around the room. To her left were Maria and her legal team, their expressions calm but focused. To her right, the faces of strangers who had shown up to support her, a reminder that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. But across the aisle sat Daniels, his face emotionless, his lawyers whispering in his ear. The sight of him made her stomach churn, but she kept her composure. This was her moment to stand tall. Outside the courthouse, the protests had reached a fever pitch. The streets were filled with people holding signs, chanting for justice, their voices echoing against the towering buildings. News cameras captured every moment, reporters providing live updates as the case unfolded. For weeks, the media had dissected every detail of Tasha's story, turning her life into a spectacle. Now the whole world seemed to be watching, waiting to see if justice would finally prevail. As the trial began, the prosecution laid out their case with precision. They played the video of the incident, the room falling silent as the footage of Daniel shaving Tasha's hair filled the screen. Gasps rippled through the audience, and Tasha could barely bring herself to watch. The prosecutor highlighted Daniel's history of complaints, painting a picture of a man who had abused his power time and time again. They called witnesses who spoke about the culture within the department, the unspoken rule of silence that protected officers like Daniels. Tasha's turn on the stand came next. As she walked to the witness chair, she felt every eye in the room on her. Her palms were sweaty, and her throat felt dry, but she refused to let her nerves show. She answered each question carefully, recounting the events of that day with as much detail as she could muster. The defense tried to rattle her, questioning her actions and implying that she had been confrontational. But Tasha held her ground, her voice steady as she made it clear that she had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. "I was scared," she said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "I didn't understand why I was being treated like a criminal. And when Officer Daniels took my hair, it wasn't just about the hair. It was about stripping away my dignity, my identity. He wanted to humiliate me, and he succeeded. But I'm here today because I won't let him take anything else from me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For a moment, the courtroom was silent, the weight of her testimony sinking in. Tasha caught a glimpse of Daniels, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. But she didn't care about his reaction. She was speaking her truth, and that was all that mattered. As the trial continued, the defense mounted their case. They called colleagues of Daniels to testify, officers who described him as a dedicated professional. They downplayed the complaints against him, framing them as misunderstandings or exaggerations. But the arguments began to unravel when Ramirez's anonymous letter was introduced. Though he had initially remained unnamed, Ramirez had eventually come forward, his conscience outweighing his fear of retaliation. Ramirez took the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he began to speak. He described what he had witnessed that day, his voice growing steadier with each word. He confirmed that Daniel's actions were unprovoked, that the officer had acted out of malice rather than necessity. He spoke about the culture of silence within the department, the pressure to look the other way. "I regret not speaking up sooner," Ramirez said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm speaking up now because what happened to Tasha was wrong. And it's time for all of us to take responsibility for the part we've played in allowing this to happen. Ramirez's testimony was a turning point. It gave the prosecution's case a newfound strength, a first-hand account that corroborated Tasha's story, but it also put a target on Ramirez's back. He received threats, his fellow officers ostracized him, and he began to fear for his career. Still, he stood by his decision, knowing it was the right thing to do. As the trial entered its final days, the pressure on everyone involved reached a breaking point. Maria worked tirelessly with her team, preparing for closing arguments and anticipating the defense's next move. Tasha, though exhausted, found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the countless nights she had cried herself to sleep, the strangers who had shown her kindness, and the strength she had discovered within herself. But just when it seemed like they were gaining the upper hand, a new challenge emerged. Late one night, Maria received an anonymous tip that Daniel's legal team was preparing to introduce a piece of evidence that could shift the narrative. The tip was vague, but it was enough to send everyone into a frenzy. Maria and her team scrambled to prepare for whatever was coming, knowing that the defense would stop at nothing to protect their client. The next morning, the courtroom was buzzing with anticipation. The defense announced they had obtained a character witness for Daniels, someone who claimed to have crucial information about Tasha. The witness, a former co-worker from the coffee shop, painted Tasha as difficult and argumentative, suggesting that her behavior might have contributed to the incident. Tasha's stomach sank as she listened, anger and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Maria quickly countered, pointing out the witness' lack of credibility and their questionable motives. But the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and Tasha could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Still, she refused to let it break her. She had come too far to give up now. As the trial neared its end, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The closing arguments loomed, and everyone knew they would determine the outcome. Outside, the protests continued, the voices of the crowd growing louder with each passing day. Tasha could feel the eyes of the world on her, the pressure to succeed heavier than ever. But she also felt something else, a sense of purpose, a belief that her fight was about more than just herself. The final moments of the trial were fast approaching, and the stakes had never been higher. Tasha knew that whatever happened next would change her life forever. As the final arguments loomed, Tasha felt a quiet determination settle over her. She had faced every curveball the defense had thrown, and though doubt lingered in the courtroom, the truth remained on her side. But just as she thought she could see a glimpse of resolution on the horizon, Maria pulled her aside with a grim expression. "We have a problem," Maria said, her voice low enough that only Tasha could hear. "I just got word that the defense has subpoenaed Daniel's body camera footage from that day. I didn't even know it existed. They're going to present it tomorrow." Tasha froze. Body camera footage. Why wasn't that shown earlier? And why would they hold it until now? Maria shook her head. "I don't know, but if they're introducing it this late, they think it works in their favor. I need to prepare for every possibility," but she hesitated before continuing. "I can't promise what's on that footage won't complicate things." Tasha's mind reeled. The existence of the footage should have been a lifeline to her case, definitive proof of what had happened. But if Daniel's team was bringing it forward now, they must have found something they could manipulate. The thought made her stomach churn. Was it possible they had tampered with it, or was there something in her behavior they planned to exploit? That night, Tasha barely slept. The idea that the defense was holding onto the footage until the last possible moment felt like a calculated move, meant to destabilize her and Maria's legal team. And despite Maria's reassurances that they would handle it, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring the fight of her life. The next day, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Word of the body camera footage had spread, and journalists lined the back of the room, their pens poised to capture every detail. When the defense finally presented the footage, the room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The footage began as a standard body camera recording, Daniel's view capturing his approach to Tasha's car. His initial demeanor seemed cold but professional. His voice clipped as he demanded her license and registration. Tasha could see herself on the screen, her hands shaking as she complied. But then the interaction began to escalate. Daniel's tone shifted, growing aggressive, and he ordered her out of the car. The footage showed Tasha hesitating, clearly fearful, before stepping out. At first, the video seemed to align with her testimony. Daniel's actions were unnecessarily harsh, his comments clearly meant to intimidate. But then came the moment the defense had been waiting for. As the camera's audio picked up Tasha asking why she was being detained, Her voice trembled with frustration. She gestured with her hands, a natural response, but the defense paused the footage dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen," the defense attorney said, turning to the jury, "you can see here how Ms. Carter's movements could be perceived as threatening." Officer Daniels was simply responding to what he believed was a potential safety risk. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Tasha's jaw clenched as she watched the scene play out. It was a stretch, twisting her fear and confusion into something that could be weaponized against her. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the footage, and the defense was using it to plant seeds of doubt. Maria stood to cross-examine, her voice steady as she addressed the jury. "What you're seeing is the reaction of a terrified woman, not a threat." Officer Daniels' response was disproportionate from the beginning. "And this footage only confirms what we've been saying all along. His actions weren't about safety, they were about control." Maria's words were powerful, but Tasha couldn't ignore the whispers among the audience. The footage had done what the defense intended. It complicated the narrative. And just when Tasha thought the day couldn't get worse, another twist emerged. During a recess, a journalist approached Maria with breaking news. Daniels' former partner, a man named Officer Grayson, had come forward with new information. He claimed that Daniels had made a habit of targeting people of color during traffic stops, often bragging about how he could get away with it. Grayson had recordings to prove it, but he was hesitant to go public, fearing retaliation. Maria pulled Tasha aside again, her expression a mix of urgency and hope. "This could change everything. If we can get Grayson to testify, it would be devastating for Daniels' defense. But it's a risk. If Grayson backs out or if the jury thinks it's a desperate move, it could hurt us." Tasha took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "Do it," she said finally. "We can't let fear stop us. Not now." Maria nodded, her determination mirroring Tasha's. She arranged a meeting with Grayson that evening, hoping to convince him to testify. But as they spoke, it became clear just how much danger Grayson was in. He had received threats, his car had been vandalized, and he worried about what would happen to his family if he took the stand. "You don't understand what it's like," he said, his voice shaking. "The department protects its own. If I go against them, I'll never be safe." Tasha leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "I do understand. I know what it feels like to be scared, to wonder if speaking up is worth the risk. But if you don't do this, Daniels and people like him will keep getting away with it. And more people will suffer." Grayson looked at her, his eyes filled with conflict. Finally he nodded. "I'll do it, but you better make sure this is worth it." When Grayson took the stand the next day, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. His testimony was damning, revealing a pattern of behavior that painted Daniels as a man who had used his badge as a weapon. The recordings Grayson provided, Daniels laughing about his actions, making derogatory remarks, left the jury visibly shaken. But even as the prosecution gained ground, the defense fought back with everything they had. They accused Grayson of being a disgruntled employee, suggested the recordings were taken out of context, and continued to focus on the body camera footage. The battle raged on, each side delivering blow after blow, the tension reaching a fever pitch. By the end of the day, Tasha felt like she was walking a tightrope. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome had never been more uncertain. As she left the courtroom, the chants of protesters echoed in her ears, their voices a reminder of why she had started this fight. But with so many forces working against her, she couldn't help but wonder, would justice truly prevail? The final day of the trial had arrived, and the courtroom was brimming with tension. Tasha sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly together, as Maria prepared a closing argument. The stakes had never been higher, and every moment of the past few weeks seemed to converge into this one. Outside, the crowd of protesters had doubled, their chants echoing through the courthouse walls. The world was watching, and everyone in that room knew it. Maria stood and faced the jury, her voice steady but impassioned. She recounted Tasha's story, reminding them of the trauma she endured and the abuse of power that had brought them all to this moment. She played snippets of Ramirez's testimony, revisited Grayson's damning recordings, and reminded the jury of Daniels' long history of complaints. As she spoke, she locked eyes with each juror, her words driving home the reality of the case. "This trial isn't just about Tasha Carter," Maria said, her voice rising with conviction. "It's about accountability. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. Officer Daniels didn't just violate Tasha's rights. He violated the trust we place in those who wear the badge. And today you have the power to hold him accountable." The defense's closing argument was equally intense, filled with attempts to cast doubt on Tasha's credibility and downplay Daniel's actions. They leaned heavily on the body camera footage, suggesting it showed a situation spiraling out of control rather than deliberate abuse. But the arguments felt hollow in the wake of Grayson's testimony and the overwhelming evidence Maria had presented. When the jury retired to deliberate, the hours stretched into what felt like an eternity. Tasha sat in the courthouse cafeteria, her nerves frayed as she waited for the verdict. Maria tried to reassure her that the weight of uncertainty was too heavy to ignore. Every possible outcome played in Tasha's mind, from complete exoneration to the horrifying possibility that Daniels might walk free. Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a decision. Tasha's heart pounded as she returned to the courtroom, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. The judge entered, and the foreperson of the jury stood, holding a small piece of paper that would determine the outcome. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Michael Daniels, guilty on all counts." Gasps filled the room, followed by a wave of murmurs. Tasha felt tears sting her eyes as the weight of the words sank in. The judge thanked the jury and announced sentencing would follow, but none of it registered. The verdict was a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Daniels sat motionless, his face pale, as the reality of his conviction settled over him. But just as the courtroom began to clear, a commotion erupted near the back. A young man pushed through the crowd, holding a folder in his hands. He called out Maria's name, his voice urgent. Security moved to intercept him, but Maria waved them off, her curiosity piqued. The man handed her the folder and whispered something in her ear before disappearing into the crowd. Maria opened the folder, her face shifting from confusion to shock as she read its contents. She immediately motioned for Tasha to follow her into a private room, her voice low but firm. "Tasha, we need to talk." Inside the folder was a series of documents, emails, and internal memos from the police department. They revealed that Daniel's superiors had known about his behavior for years and had actively covered it up. Complaints had been buried, witnesses intimidated, and disciplinary actions avoided. Worse yet, one of the memos suggested that Daniels had been encouraged to target marginalized communities as part of an unspoken policy to maintain order in certain neighborhoods. Tasha's stomach turned as she processed the information. This wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was systemic. The very foundation of the department was built on a culture of corruption and discrimination. Maria's face was grim as she closed the folder. "This changes everything," she said. "We're not just fighting Daniels anymore, we're fighting the entire system." In the days that followed, Maria filed a motion to bring the new evidence to light. The public reaction was explosive. Protests grew larger, demanding not only justice for Tasha but a complete overhaul of the police department. The media ran story after story, exposing the corruption and forcing city officials to address the issue. Daniel's sentencing day arrived, and the courtroom was once again packed. The judge delivered a harsh sentence, citing the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct and the damage he had caused. But for Tasha, the fight was far from over. She and Maria had already begun building a case against the department, determined to dismantle the system that had allowed Daniels to thrive. As Tasha left the courthouse that day, she was met with a sea of supporters. People cheered, held signs, and chanted her name. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had started this journey as a terrified young woman, unsure of her place in the world. But now she stood tall, ready to take on whatever came next. And as she looked out at the crowd, she couldn't help but wonder, if one person could make this much noise, what could they all accomplish together?